Happy... Oh god, Valentine's Day is the next holiday. Let's finish the Halloween video. I think that would be a good thing for us to do. This video will contain spoilers for Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed, and by extension Xenoblade 1 and 2 as well, though I will probably avoid most major things that aren't implicitly spoiled within 3 and Future Redeemed Zone narrative. Last time I tried to make a video on the Husks, I was going into it trying to make a Halloween special that was a bit on the goofier side, not taking itself too seriously with the tone of the spooky scary skeleton song. I very quickly ran into the fact that Aionios is a very bad place actually, and Mobius does horrible things to the soldiers of Keves and Agnes at all times. So, this time I'm going to try approaching the video with that premise all rooted in my mind already, and actually try to properly Lux and style overanalyze things. I'm not going to have concrete answers for everything, and I'm going to leave a few things open-ended on purpose because I'm sure the art book will have something resembling an answer to some of those things. So, we're just gonna do this again. It's been long enough. Let's get it done. As far as we can tell, rules about death in Aionios are slightly hazy. I can't really tell you how it works for animals and monsters. Most of them, both in cutscenes and gameplay, just disintegrate after dying, like a lot of sentient beings, as I'll explain in a minute, but they can also be cooked and eaten sometimes, so I'm not quite sure how that works yet. I'm also not sure how it works for the sentient races that are not in the Flame Clock system. When the Jumbo Turkin dies in Gondor's Ascension quest, he collapses, the camera zooms out on the body for a few seconds, and then it hard cuts to a text-based cutscene where they just never point the camera directly where the body was in the immediately preceding cutscene. I'm not sure if they were intentionally trying to obfuscate things, but they did a really good job of it. So I'm not quite sure how it works for Turkin and Ignas and people like that. Napon are also weird because they're Napon in Aionios, they're going to be no matter what. They have Riku that makes them weird as is. And because we also never see or hear anything about them actually dying directly at any point in the game. That being said, my guess would be, since they're completely exempt from the entire Flame Clock system, that non-origin avatar Napon, so people besides the 7 legendary ones, just work the same way humans in the city do, and that makes sense because we don't see Napon husks or corpses, so they probably do disintegrate. Then we arrive at the races that can be subject to a flame clock. And it seems like there are actual hard and fast rules here. If you are a soldier of Keves and Agnes bound to a flame clock, and you die at any point before your timer runs out, you will leave behind a husk. Husks aren't just the result of getting killed by a blade from the enemy nation and having your life force absorbed into their colony's clock. We see husks of people that we can confirm have been killed by monsters, by Levnesses, and by Mobius. So that is just the end state of anyone who doesn't reach homecoming. If a soldier does reach homecoming age, or is in the very special case of Ethel and Cammuravi, they will disintegrate, evaporating into light motes. That is the confirmed fate of everyone from the city, but it might extend a little further than that because I believe that it also extends to, at the very least, Ouroboros who used to be soldiers, but potentially also any soldier freed from a flame clock. As in Noah's flashbacks of previous lives, we can see other previous lives of him and Mio fade away when they are killed, and we know those versions did not reach homecoming like the ones that became N and M did. Based on all of this, we can pretty reasonably assume that fading into light is the natural end state for a sentient being in Aionios, and Mobius has them turn into husks for some particular reason. I'm basically going to spend the rest of the video trying to figure out what that reason could be, but I do think it's also worth laying a lot of groundwork here, because people dying differently has to be a function of Aionios and not something biological. The soldiers of Keves and Agnes are genetic duplicates of the original versions of those people from the original world. The only things that are physically different about them and can't just be explained by having different life experiences are the iris, the Mobius psychological conditioning I discussed several months ago now, and the lifespan limit of 10 years. They still need to eat, they still need to pee and poop, and any physical racial traits are not vestigial. While it takes the Mobius conditioning being broken for characters to even realize that there are different races in the first place, a Colony Gamma side quest does explore the fact that, yes, Uni does have a naturally higher aptitude for ether. Lenz's muscle fibers are stronger and more metallic than Noah's. Not to mention the fact that power frames exist in the first place because all the Agnians who have core crystals get naturally higher physical stats. And then there's also the fact that the soldier's biology is so authentic to how it should be that they could still reproduce. Y was so confident in his conditioning that gets broken like 3 different ways throughout the story that he didn't bother sterilizing his army of teenagers. But you can have children with someone who's from a different universe than you. I don't quite know how that part works. Like, yeah, regular parallel universes and alternate timelines, that makes perfect sense. If this universe collides with one where the timeline diverged because someone did something different back in 1752, yeah, people are going to just be genetically modern humans. Everyone's going to be able to have kids with everyone. That's no problem. But I don't think that's going to work if we collide with a universe different enough from this one where catgirls exist. Just saying. The explanation for this, for Husks, and for fading away could just simply be that Aionios works differently, and as such, it has different physical rules that govern things like life. That is a reasonable explanation, but it's kind of a cop-out and also really boring, and I think people would be very annoyed at me if I ended the video just at that. So we're gonna talk about more things. Unfortunately, the next most obvious explanation is just about as vague and poorly defined, and that's just, this world is governed by origin. Origin has to do with souls. It's a soul thing. Jokes aside, I think a very reasonable explanation for what a husk is simply the natural state of a body in the xenocosmology that's had its soul forcibly removed. We know that soldiers are grown to the age of 10 in cradles, slapped with enough life force to last another 10 years, and sent out to war. We also know that souls are stored in origin, and that in every life, including the original worlds, soldiers are fundamentally the same person. So it goes to reason that, with the cosmic exception of Noah and Mio, whenever a soldier is born in a cradle, their soul is taken out of origin, and that soul then returns to origin once their body dies. It seems like within Aionios itself, you need 3 things to properly be alive: a body that can function, the nebulous concept of life force, and the even more nebulous concept of a soul, which seems to also be tied to someone's base personality and core memories from the original world. If you take out any of those, something happens. We never see someone's soul get stolen, so I can't really speak on what would happen there, nor do we see anyone from the city die of old age. But we do have 3 other options for what would happen. If a soldier gets their body killed, they leave behind a husk as long as the body isn't completely incinerated or something. If a soldier runs out of life force because they reach homecoming, they will fade away. And if a citizen's body gets killed, they will also fade away. If you also keep in mind the fact that husk is a very good term that's been used in fiction before for a body without a soul in it, things start to come together. Dying in Aionios means your soul can't go to where it's supposed to go. We don't really know where that is. There's not really a full explanation of how afterlives work in any Xeno universe. But origin is there, and that's not a thing in any other world either, so we could pretty reasonably assume that, yeah, all the souls go to that place. If a soldier dies before homecoming, their soul will go back to origin, and whatever life force was still in the body, the life force that would have lasted them to the end of their term limit, is either absorbed by a blade that's killed them and brought into the flame clock of the colony of that blade's owner, or presumably, I guess, just disperses out into the world. Maybe there is still a sort of thing like decomposing bodies being able to provide nutrients to the soil because the ether from the life force disperses a little bit, or something along those lines. Not really sure on that. The other important thing is dying because you reached homecoming age and dying of old age are actually 2 separate things. The bodies of the soldiers are physically capable of supporting life for decades longer than the term limit. They're just only provided with enough of this metaphysical life force to last that long. So when the life force runs out, the body just can't hold itself together, and that disintegrates. When you die of old age, that's still a body death, not a life force death, as your body physically can't keep going, and things break down to the point where you die. That is a different thing than a magic force that keeps you animated running out. It is the physical parts of the body not working, as opposed to anything spiritual. I think that explains the different fates of the soldiers reasonably well, but what about the citizens? This, I think, has a much simpler explanation, believe it or not. As I said before, we never see someone from the city actually die of old age, though we know it must be possible because it happens to both Nicole and Glimmer at the very least. That being said, we can pretty reasonably assume that there is no way for a citizen to die in Aionios and leave behind a body, as the Affinity Scene dialogue about King Agni's tomb in Future Redeemed shows that Matthew is unfamiliar with the idea of a sarcophagus or coffin, and A needs to compare a body to a husk, not just for the benefit of Nicole and Glimmer, who obviously wouldn't know, but even Matthew himself. Well, yes, it's Matthew. There are a vast many things that man does not know. He's also surprisingly old if you compare things in the timeline together. Like, he's got to be in his mid-20s for things to make sense, and I refuse to believe that if corpses were a thing in the world, he wouldn't have at least heard of them by his mid-20s. So we could pretty reasonably assume that citizens always fade away. Why is that, though? We know that Origin is also storing the souls of people not bound to the flame clocks. Anyone new born in Aionios is also recorded, with the chance of them being reborn into the new world created after the end of the game. So, what exactly is the process of getting recorded into Origin? Well, with the exception of a select few characters, everyone is described as being assimilated into it, which means they disintegrated and only had physical bodies after they were recreated using Mobius technology that put the soul from Origin back in them, which suggests that in order to have your entire essence recorded by Origin to such a degree that your soul can then be preserved and put in a new body later on, your entire body needs to be recorded. Maybe for whatever reason, they need full biometric data in order to properly get a handle on the soul. Unless you join Mobius, like Shania and some other characters who are clearly older than 20, like Kay and Triton had to be, you only get one life if you're born to the city. But upon death, you are assimilated into Origin, like everyone did at the formation of Aionios, with the hopes that, while you won't be reconstructed in the new world because you weren't part of the old ones, you may still be reborn someday, to get the one proper life you deserve, same as everyone else. The only potential hang-up here is Origin recording the entire biological data of someone, but them not likely being born the same genetically in the new world. I think it would be very deterministic and very anti-Xenoblade if what actually happened is all of the couples among the soldiers who got together in Aionios at any point throughout any incarnations got together again, had the exact same children, then those exact same children keep having kids again and again, generation after generation for 1,000 years, and you end up with the exact same people that we see in the city in the present day in the base game. That seems wrong. But I do think that instead of a new soul being created out of wherever it normally is in Xeno games, souls from Origin that were born in Aionios will basically take priority over a new one being created whenever a new child in the new world is born, until the souls in Origin are exhausted. That being said, Noah and Mio are obviously still going to get together. They might live long enough to have multiple children this time, but at the very least, their firstborn is going to be the same soul as their firstborn in Aionios, and probably also coincidentally will biologically end up the exact same as the old man Gondor we know and love, and his descendants will eventually just end up being Matthew and Niall, but someone a lot more generations apart from an original pair of soldiers like a Grey will likely be more reincarnated than fully reborn in the new world, where it'll clearly be the same person, but they might be a different race, a different sex, a samurai gunner instead of a full metal jaguar, and resemble a different content creator than Alpharad. Maybe we're getting Joe Sniffy Gray instead next time. I couldn't tell you. The only issue with this is Ethel and Cammuravi, who, while they are in their last term, die in battle and fade away. I think with a combination of just like a hand-wavy explanation and a thematic one, we can pretty reasonably justify this as well. The hand-wavy explanation is they're tied to experimental flame clocks as opposed to the regular flame clocks that everyone who leaves behind a husk is tied to, so maybe they die differently. We're gonna get into how husks are probably a Mobius conspiracy in a minute, so I wouldn't put it past Y to just turn off the husk setting on experimental flame clocks so he can get the proof of concept working before having to debug it with connections to other systems. On a thematic level, this is Ethel and Cammuravi choosing how to die, as warriors who want to fight each other instead of people doing the bidding of Mobius, and as such, they would completely vanish, going to a place beyond Mobius's reach, as opposed to turning into husks, leaving a physical reminder of themselves as an example to any future soldiers who may cross them. The one thing we can be for certain, though, is that they didn't burn through extra life force faster because of their battle or because of the experimental clocks or anything, because they're both able to be reincarnated more or less immediately after, and it does still seem like nobody was lying when they said Homecoming takes you out of the cycle, because as far as we can tell, Noah and Mio are genuinely the only two exceptions to that rule. And yet, it is kind of tragic that M was one of the people to invent the concept of homecoming and being freed from the cycle in the first place, and yet Mio was one of the two people who could not escape that. So, all of this being said, why husks? And here is where another vile Mobius conspiracy rears its ugly head. We already know that the Motes of Light are a fraud. They come from Yoren's mud puppets and from the personal effects of deceased Lost Number soldiers. It's been theorized that they're a representation of data such as memories being transferred back to Origin, and that may be true, but in practice, they don't do anything for the dead. They're simply a placebo for the living, to make them hope that their deceased comrades are in a better place. It's something to maintain morale and keep the soldiers fighting. And this is what I believe the husks are designed to be, but in a very different sense. It may have its own litany of problems, but it's pretty stressed that life in the city is closer to how things should be. At least in the sense that people are able to live a full natural lifespan if they're lucky enough. And when people from the city die, they just evaporate. When most monsters and animals die, they just evaporate. When Mobius die, they just evaporate. Despite it being closer to how it works in the real world and the old worlds Aionios was made out of, it really does seem like leaving a husk behind when you die is more unnatural than it is natural. And seeing as how they control everything else behind the soldiers' lives, Mobius is pretty likely behind this too. But why did Y do this? In a world where no one leaves a corpse, what's the motivation for Mobius to reinvent the wheel? Well, besides X, Y, and Z having memories of the previous world and knowing that's how things worked, and them being built around the fear and uncertainty of the future, they might want to take solace in things being closer to how they've always been. But I was talking about motivation, and it probably is motivation as well. There are two ways to convince people to fight for you, besides like the obvious psychological conditioning and brainwashing Mobius does to everyone. The first is from Homecoming and the Light Motes, trying to convince people that they will be treated well and go to a better place if they succeed in war. And the second is to make them hate the opposition. Something that we see very clearly in cutscenes even after getting freed from the flame clocks. Kavesi and Agnians do still have a very hard time getting along. This is going to sound really, really bad when I first say it, so just bear with me for a second. It is weird that Mobius doesn't use racism as a tactic here. Given everything else Mobius did, it is slightly surprising that when they were trying to take their one group of indoctrinated children and make it fight the other group of indoctrinated children from a different universe with a lot of different physical characteristics, they didn't go, hey, those people have different furry ears on the top of their head, none of you guys have that. And then, hey, those people have metallic skin and wings on their head, that's not like you. They're bad, you should go kill them. They don't do that. They explicitly made not being able to tell differences between races, not just between Keves and Agnes, but within the nations, part of the psychological conditioning. This, though, does have the secondary effect of completely erasing all of the unique history and culture from people like the Gormati, the Machina, the Hyentia, and so forth. I know it's a complaint about how homogenized things like culture are even between both Keves and Agnes, but I think it's kind of thematically important that even the city is like that, and the Napon are the only people in Aionios who really retain their original identity and culture from the previous worlds. I think I will play Xenoblade 3 today. What's this doing here? All that being said, Mobius does still obviously use xenophobia to make Keves and Agnes hate each other. There's plenty of othering still going on there. And that is likely not the only thing to motivate hatred that they use. Othering, and then the second, is desire for revenge. That, I think, is the biggest deal here. Husks aren't just a different version of corpses. They're more durable than corpses. They last longer. They don't decompose. You could go back there in a month or 100 years, and you will still see husks as long as they haven't been buried or eroded away. If you come across a Kevesi husk, even if it's someone you've never met or a colony you didn't recognize, you'll be able to think, oh, that person was probably killed by Agnians, barring obvious wounds from something else, of course. If you're Kevesi and you see that, you go, those damn Agnians killed someone from another colony. This is someone I will never get to meet because of them. And if you're Agnian and see it, you cheer because this wasn't our colony that did this. That means some other Agnians out there are taking out the bastards just as well as we are. It's good to know that there are other Agnians out there fighting the good fight, and we're not alone. Two sides of motivation from one husk. Keep in mind, husks exist and are well known to everyone at the time period of Future Redeemed, as in either just after or just before off-seeing was invented, which means that the technique of off-seeing was designed so that there would be no effect on the husk. You would get the light motes to make the friends of the deceased or whatever off-seer happened to run across them feel better. But the reminder of what the other people did would always still remain. Empathy for the in-group and hatred for the other group, all fostered just from one simple choice to not have everyone fade away. There's also the fact that Mobius controls the cradles, which means they probably have some influence over which soldiers get reborn. Again, Noah and Mio being the obvious exception. Which means homecoming probably isn't a set rule of Aionios and was again solely invented for the purpose of motivation. It tracks then that husks, the opposite of homecoming, were invented for a similar reason. If you think that it's weird that this would be designed as a system because there are obvious flaws in a system, you would be correct. Uni finding her own husk and retaining a slight bit of memory is a piece of clear indication that whatever Mobius is doing is not absolute and can be circumvented, and that just kind of makes this more likely. While it did admittedly take Uni becoming Ouroboros and leaving the domain of her colony to find her husk in the first place, everything Mobius does on a grand scale has at least one glaring flaw that they're too arrogant to notice. And based on their role in the story and what they're supposed to represent, this absolutely makes sense as a Mobius conspiracy. Unjust systems and regimes like Mobius are always going to fall in the end. That being said, I couldn't tell you anything about the nitty-gritty mechanics of how any of this specifically works. How does a genetically normal person turn into a husk? How does a genetically normal person disintegrate? Why, despite the light motes not being a real thing, are there weirdly consistent rules with how and when each color of mote is produced? That I couldn't tell you. It's Xenoblade 3. You kind of do have to focus more on the themes than the actual technical execution of a lot of things in order to fully understand and appreciate what's being explained here. And don't worry, I could still be completely wrong. We're getting an art book in a few months that could turn all of this video on its head. And if it does, I'll be here to explain that as well, and why that is probably even more thematically relevant and poignant than anything I could have possibly discussed today. But yeah, welcome to the second month of 2024. We are now done with a video that was supposed to come out in the 10th month of 2023. Next time, I will be making a Falcom news video about some Falcom news that was announced in December of 2023. And then, I can't say it's going to be in February yet, but I am going to try and get the Riku video done by my birthday, March 4th. So until whichever one of those you feel like watching, this is Luxon, signing off.